the Oscar goes to Jordan Peele, Get Out.
This is the first Oscar for three-time nominee Jordan Peele. He is also nominated tonight as director and producer.
That was writer, director, and co-producer Jordan Peele accepting his Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay for Get Out at the 90th Academy Awards. Peele's film was also nominated for Best Picture, but he lost to Guillermo del Toro in his film, The Shape of Water. Hi, I'm Patrick Smith, and I'm the host and curator of Movie Club, and I'm so delighted to welcome you here tonight to our incredible screening of the modern horror classic, Get Out. The movie was filmed over 23 days in the communities of Mobile and Fairhope, Alabama. Following its release, the film stayed in the U.S. box office for the first 2 months of its theatrical run. The film wasn't just popular, it was also incredibly financially viable for producers Blumhouse, as it was only made on a $4.5 million budget, pretty small for a modern film, and it made that money back and more, taking in $34 million in its opening weekend alone. This launched Jordan Peele into the stratosphere upon his debut feature and made him a voice to be reckoned with in a modern auteur. Get Out is also an important film critically. It's one of only 6 horror films to ever be nominated for Best Picture. It's in good company alongside The Exorcist, Jaws, The Silence of the Lambs, The Sixth Sense, and Black Swan. This film not only eviscerates overt racism, it also shows us the implicit everyday racism that even some of us are quite a part of. Daniel Kaluuya, the star who plays Chris Washington in the film, our lead, has said that the party scene in the film is incredibly accurate and shows quite explicitly and artistically the experience of black people everywhere and the questions that they're asked that shows the implicit racism that is still so very much present and prevalent in our modern society. This even includes white liberals who like to think that they're woke and on top of things, and the questions they ask that have microaggressions and just tiny kernels that chip away the humanity of black men and women. In reference to one of the most impactful and important concepts from the film, Peele had this to say about the sunken place. The sunken place means we're marginalized. No matter how hard we scream, the system silences us. Peele first began work on the initial draft of Get Out back during President Barack Obama's first term. At the time, Peele mostly wrote Get Out as a passion project, unsure if the time would ever come where he could or would be able to make such a film. With the advent and rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and continued media coverage of the killings by police of unarmed black men and women, Peele knew that the time had finally come to debut his film. While there is a bit of debate about whether or not Get Out is a thriller or a horror movie, I'd like to talk about for a second why I don't think that argument is very important. You see, thriller by definition is a subgenre of horror, meaning that it is part of a larger genre. Thriller typically is a much more grounded horror movie that surrounds itself with much more realistic terror, such as home invasion or serial killers. That's why films like The Silence of the Lambs, the only horror film to ever win Best Picture, is among the thriller genre. But here's the distinct issue I have with this argument. Thriller in the modern discourse is often used to differentiate between horror films that we want to talk about and we think are valuable and horror films we think are trash. Instead of trying to understand the artistry behind both camps, between the whole genre and this subsection of genre that we like to lift up and value more, we make this distinction and essentially create a high art, low art dichotomy, which is not important and not a valuable use of time, because both types of art, high art and low art, deserve critical reasoning and critical discussion. And to differentiate between horror films that are worth your time and horror films that are just trivial trash, I think is purposeless. And it just goes to prove the bias that the Academy and other groups that vote on these things, vote on which films deserve recognition, the bias they have against the horror genre as a whole. They have to completely redefine a word in order to say this film is valuable. Get Out and The Silence of the Lambs and all those other films I mentioned that have been nominated for Best Picture before aren't just thrillers. They're part of the horror genre. And to make that differentiation essentially says that these films are worth lifting up while the rest of the genre is complete trash. And I don't buy that, because I've seen quite a few good horror films, especially in recent memory, and even digging back into the origins of this genre. And so I think it's trivial and purposeless to continue this discourse, because more often than not, they're doing it in bad faith. They're deciding which films are worthy to be a part of critical canon and which films will be disregarded by history. So the next time you hear someone use those terms, thriller, and say that they're much better than horror movies, remind them that thriller is a subgenre of horror. They maybe have a preference for thriller films within the larger horror genre, but they still like horror movies. If they dismiss your argument and don't listen to you, just know they're intending to have a bad faith argument. You do not have to argue with them. So now let me return to my introduction of the horror movie, Get Out. The film Get Out centers on our protagonist, Chris Washington, played by Daniel Kaluuya, who goes to visit his white girlfriend's parents one weekend in an effort to get to know the family better, because he really does like this girl. But quickly, when it turns out that this weekend also happens to be a massive family gathering, things turn a bit more nightmarish, and Chris must find a way to get out.
Get out. Sorry, man. Get out!
Just as the title suggests. Now, I won't spend too much time discussing what all happens here, because I want to leave the twists up to you to discover if you've never seen this film before. But I am absolutely delighted that you get to experience this film tonight, because it's one of my favorite horror films of recent memory and just one of my favorite movies.
We are the gods, trapped in cocoons.
And given the fact that for the first 2 weeks of its theatrical run, it had 100% on Rotten Tomatoes and has now only fallen to 98%, I think it proves just how good and interesting, compelling Jordan Peele's vision in this film are. It's not just a great horror movie. It's a great and important film. And that's why, without any further ado, I am delighted to bring to you tonight Jordan Peele's directorial debut, Get Out. Where'd my tea go? What are you doing with my tea?
Now, sink into the